The sun hung low over dry land. Dust rolled across the empty field. A crow circled once, then flew off toward the hills. Inside the barnyard fence, Elias Ward, the rancher, carried a bucket of water. Elias lived alone, day after day, with only cattle for company. The man's face was cut by years of sun and wind. His eyes, grey and steady, scanned the ground out of habit. Movement flashed at the edge of his sight. Elias froze. His hand slid to the rifle on his shoulder. He lifted the weapon, body tense. In this country, shadows often meant raiders or thieves. Elias Ward had buried neighbors before, but the figure on the dirt was no raider. A child crawled on hands and knees, thin as bone. The boy's skin was cracked from sun, his hair tangled with dust. Elias took one slow step closer, rifle still raised. The child clutched something at his chest. A silver locket, dull with age, glinted in the light. The boy's small fingers locked around it as if it was his only shield. Elias's breath caught. Proof of family, maybe, proof of loss, Elias called out, voice sharp. Who's there? The boy lifted his head. His lips moved, broken words scraping out. Food. Please. The rifle lowered. The sound of need cut deeper than any threat. Elias Ward, rancher, stood silent. For years, men had warned him never to help strangers. But the child was only skin and bone. Mercy pressed harder than fear. Elias set the rifle against the barn wall. He bent down, arms rough but steady, and lifted the boy from the dirt. The child's weight was nothing. Elias carried him inside the barn, boots crunching over straw. Inside, shadows stretched long. Elias laid the boy on a bench and brought water from the bucket. He set out a hard crust of bread. The child's hands shook as he reached for it, still. Clutching the silver locket with the other hand, Elias watched the locket shine in the lantern glow. Slow, Elias said. Eat slow. The boy nodded once, crumbs falling as he chewed. His eyes flicked toward the barn door, wide with fear. Elias Ward followed the gaze. Something out there had chased the child here. Elias stepped outside. His boots sank in dust. He scanned the open land. The wind pushed against his hat, carrying the smell of horse sweat. On the ground near the barn he found tracks, fresh hoofprints cut deep in the soil. Several riders, moving fast. His rifle felt heavier when he picked it up again. Elias Ward, the rancher, knew what this meant. Someone wanted that boy back or wanted him dead. Either way, trouble was riding closer. From the doorway, the child's small voice carried out, Food. Thank you. Elias turned his head. The boy sat with the locket in hand, holding it tight against his chest. Elias studied it again, the faint glimmer of a woman's face locked inside. Whoever the woman was, she had once mattered. Proof tokens outlast men. The rancher looked back to the hills. The setting sun threw long shadows down the slopes. One shadow twitched where no rock should move. Elias Ward's gut twisted. He was not alone. He whispered low, more to himself than anyone. What have I done? The boy ate in silence. The land outside grew darker, and on the ridge above, new shapes gathered, watching the barn. The lantern flame shook against the barn wall. Dust floated in the glow. The wind outside pressed against the boards. Elias Ward, the rancher, sat across from the boy. The child's face was thin, but the eyes burned sharp. Elias set the lantern on the table and spoke low. Name. What's your name, son? The boy's voice cracked but steady. Chaska. He swallowed and looked at Elias. Son of a warrior. Elias Ward leaned back, boots grinding straw. The name carried weight. The boy's small hand tugged at the silver locket on his chest. The lid opened, and inside lay the faded photo of a woman. Elias studied the picture, then closed it with care. Proof that the boy was not just a runaway, proof he carried family. Chaska coughed and spoke again. Raid, hunger, I run. His English was broken, but his meaning was clear. His tribe had suffered. The boy fled to survive. Elias Ward, rancher, rubbed his jaw. Running brings trouble with it. His words dropped heavy into the barn. A sound cut him off, a sharp creak from the barn door. Elias grabbed his rifle, heart tight. He pushed the door open with the barrel. Night air rushed in, cool and sharp. Elias stepped outside. The ground was still warm from day heat. He crouched, low lantern light spilling across dirt. That's when Elias saw it, a broken arrow. The shaft splintered, the tip cracked. Elias picked it up, the wood rough against his palm. Proof token number 2. He turned it over, jaw set. The arrow was fresh. Elias Ward, rancher, lifted his eyes to the horizon. The moon cut silver across the land. On the ridge, small shapes flickered. Shadows of riders. They were there, watching. Elias's chest grew tight. He stepped back inside and set the broken arrow on the table. Chaska stared at it, eyes wide. His lips trembled. "They will come for me." The words hit harder than the desert wind. Elias Ward felt the weight of the locket and the broken arrow together. Signs of family and signs of pursuit. Both sat before him in the same child. Elias placed a heavy hand on Chaska's shoulder. "Then we best be ready." The boy gripped. The locket tighter, as if courage lived inside the metal. The barn groaned, wood straining under night air. Outside, the wind shifted again. Elias Ward heard it then. Hooves. Slow at first, then stronger. The ground seemed to shake. The rancher stepped toward the barn door, rifle tight in his hand. Chaska's voice carried soft but clear from behind him. "Not stop, they come." Elias Ward stared out into the black land. The broken arrow lay on the table inside. The silver locket glinted against the boy's chest, and the sound of hooves rolled closer, each beat like thunder across the plain. The night was no longer quiet. The barn lantern flickered, shadows crawling across the walls. The wind carried the faint echo of hooves across the plains. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood by, the door with his rifle ready. His jaw tightened. He had taken in Chaska, the starving boy, and now the weight of that choice pressed hard on his chest. Trouble was riding closer. Chaska sat on the bench, silver locket still clutched against his chest. The boy's eyes followed every move Elias made. Elias pulled a wooden bar across the barn door and stacked hay bales near the walls for cover. His hands moved fast, practiced, each step of fortifying sharp and sure. Chaska rose slowly, legs weak. The boy stepped forward and held out a small necklace strung with red and black beads. The beads looked old, worn smooth from years of touch. The boy pressed it into Elias's rough hand. "For you." Elias stared at it. Proof, token number 3. A gift of trust, a bond made in the middle of fear. Elias tied the necklace around his wrist, the beads cold at first. "You don't know me, son," Elias muttered. Chaska lifted his chin. "Now, you protect." The words cut straight into Elias's chest. The rancher froze for a moment. Memories surged. Elias saw his brother's face, younger, full of life. Before death had taken him in a border raid. Elias had not protected him then. His fists clenched tight around the rifle. "I failed once," Elias whispered. "Not again." The bond was sealed in firelight. Elias Ward, rancher, turned back to his work. He dragged heavy crates, nailed boards across the windows, and set extra rounds of ammunition on the table. Chaska carried what little he could, pulling a blanket to block a draft in the wall. Every small act was part of their defense. Outside, the land grew darker. A coyote howled across the hills, breaking the silence. Elias Ward peered out through a crack in the boards. The moon painted the plain in silver, and his eyes caught it, the spark of fire far away. Not a campfire, moving light, a torch. Then another. Chaska stood at Elias's side, locket shining faint in the lantern glow. His voice shook. "They come." Elias gripped the rifle tighter, beads pressing into his skin. Proof tokens. The locket, the arrow, the necklace, all tied to the boy, all now tied to him. He had chosen mercy, and mercy would demand blood. The torches on the ridge grew brighter, each flame a warning. Riders lined the horizon like black, teeth against the sky. Elias Ward's breath came slow but steady. He placed one hand on Chaska's shoulder and spoke low. "No matter what happens, we stand together." The barn creaked as the wind pressed harder. The shadows deepened. Out on the ridge, fire spread like a line of stars, an army waiting for dawn. The boy whispered again, voice barely a breath. Oath. Elias Ward, rancher, whispered back. Oath. The first torch lifted higher, a signal against the night. The night sky burned with torchlight. Flames bobbed along the ridge like restless stars. The wind carried faint shouts across the plains. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood at the barn door with his rifle ready. The bead necklace on his wrist cut against his skin with every grip. Chaska sat inside, silver locket tight in his small fist. Both tokens gleamed under the weak lantern light. The sound of hooves grew closer. 3 riders broke from the ridge and rode fast toward the barn. The ground shook under their charge. Elias pulled the door shut and braced it with his shoulder. The riders slowed near the fence, circling like wolves. One rider raised a hand, signaling the others to hold. Elias Ward stepped outside, rifle leveled. His boots dug into the dirt, steady as stone. The riders stayed mounted, faces hidden in shadow, torches spitting sparks. One rider called out in broken English, "Give, boy, no fight." Chaska pressed against the door frame, locket clutched so hard his knuckles turned white. The boy's eyes never left the riders. Elias Ward shouted back, voice sharp. "Leave the boy!" The words cracked the night. The riders shifted in their saddles. The leader pointed and one horse stepped forward. Elias fired. The rifle roared, the bullet striking the ground in front of the lead horse. Dirt exploded. The animal reared and screamed. The rider jerked the reins, barely holding on. For a moment, silence cut through the chaos. Smoke from the rifle drifted between Elias and the riders. Elias Ward, rancher, stood unmoved. His grey eyes dared them to cross the line. The lead rider shouted in his own tongue. The other 2 pulled back, circling wide. Chaska trembled, his breath ragged. Elias stepped back to the boy, laying a hand on his shoulder. "Stay low," the child whispered. "They come back." Elias Ward checked the rifle, sliding another round into place. "Let them." One rider leaned forward, torchlight hitting his face. His eyes burned with anger. He called out, "This not end." Then the 3 turned their horses, kicking up dust. They galloped back toward the ridge, flames whipping behind them. Elias exhaled, lowering the rifle. The barn stood quiet for a heartbeat. Inside, the lantern crackled. Chaska loosened his grip, just enough for the locket to fall against his chest. The silver caught the light, proof of family still alive in memory. Elias looked at it, then at the boy's fearful face. He muttered low, "This is just the start." Elias moved quickly, dragging more crates to reinforce the windows. Chaska followed, helping as best he could. Both worked in silence, the sound of hammering boards cutting the night. Each strike was heavy, final. When the noise stopped, Elias stepped outside again. His eyes scanned the ridge. What he saw froze him in place. More torches. Not 3, not 10 dozens. Flames lined the horizon, spreading in both directions. The riders had not given up. They had only gathered more. Elias Ward gripped the rifle harder, the bead necklace tight against his wrist. Behind him, Chaska's small hand clung to the silver locket once again. The boy whispered, "More come." Elias did not answer. The ridge burned with light. The barn, once only a home, now stood as a fortress. The night was far from over. The night bled into morning. Pale light spilled over the plains, washing the land in grey. Elias Ward, the rancher, leaned against the barn wall. His rifle rested across his knees, but his mind carried a heavier weight. The silver locket on Chaska's chest caught the first ray of sun. The bead necklace on Elias's wrist dug into his skin, a reminder of the boy's trust. Elias's eyes traced the horizon. The torchlights of the night had faded, but the danger had not. He turned back inside, watching Chaska eat the last crumbs of bread. The boy looked smaller than ever in the wide barn. Elias Ward thought of his own years, alone since his brother's death, alone after his father's ranch fell to dust, alone with only cattle, tools, and silence for company. Isolation had become armor, but now the armor cracked. A starving boy had broken through where bullets never had. Elias cleared his throat. "Maybe safer if you left." The words came hard. "You walk east. Find your people. Trouble follows you here." Chaska froze. His hand gripped the locket so tight his knuckles whitened. His head shook once, slow, but firm. "Please." The boy whispered, voice sharp with fear. "Not alone." The plea struck Elias harder than any rider's threat. He remembered his brother's last cry in a raid, remembered not reaching him in time. Elias Ward could not repeat that mistake. He looked at the boy, then at the proof tokens, necklace and locket. They tied the boy's fate to his own. Elias drew in a long breath. "All right then, you stay." His words came steady, carved in stone. "We face this together." Chaska's eyes filled with a fragile fire. The boy leaned close, whispering, "Family now." Elias Ward placed a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. The bond was sealed. Loyalty was chosen. But outside, the world shifted again. Elias stepped into the morning light, rifle ready. The plains stretched wide and empty. For a moment, silence. Then the ground itself seemed to move. Shapes appeared on the horizon. Horsemen. First 10, then 20, then more. Elias's gut tightened as the line grew longer. 50 riders spread across the plain, their forms black against the rising sun. The barn door groaned in the wind. Chaska stepped beside Elias, clutching the silver locket close. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle, beads biting into his wrist. The boy's whisper carried on the wind. "They are here." Elias Ward did not move. His eyes locked on the riders. Fear rose, but so did resolve. Dawn had come, and with it the war. The riders held the plain like a wall of iron. Dust rose from the horses' hooves, hanging in the air like smoke. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood in front of the barn with rifle in hand. Chaska stayed behind him, silver locket clutched close to his chest. The bead necklace on Elias's wrist pressed hard into his skin, a reminder of the bond they had made. From the line of warriors, one rider broke forward. He rode slow, steady, not rushing. The others gave him space. The man was tall, broad in the shoulders, with black hair braided down his back. He carried no torch, only a long knife across his belt. The horse stopped 20 paces from Elias. The man raised a hand in greeting. Elias gripped the rifle but held his ground. The rider dismounted, boots striking the earth with calm weight. His voice came deep, measured. "I am Tall Crow, uncle of the boy, son of the old chief." The words cut through the morning air. Chaska stepped out from the barn, eyes wide. "Uncle." Tall Crow's eyes softened for a breath, then hardened again. He pointed at Elias. "Give boy. This not your fight." Elias Ward, rancher, stood straight. "The boy came to me, starving, begged for food. I won't turn him out." Tall Crow's gaze flicked to the bead necklace on Elias's wrist. The man's eyes narrowed, reading the sign. "He gave you this." Elias lifted his wrist so the red and black beads caught the sun. "He did. I took the oath." For a moment, silence. The line of warriors shifted, waiting. Tall Crow looked from Elias to Chaska, then back again. His jaw tightened, but there was no mockery in his face, only weight. "You stand against 200 for one starving child," Elias answered plain. "I stand because no one stood for me when it mattered." Chaska pressed the locket tight, eyes locked on his uncle. The child's voice cracked. "I stay, he is family." Tall Crow's head turned toward the boy. For a breath, his stance softened, as though the bond was visible to him. Then the hardness returned. He stepped closer, close enough for Elias to see the knife's edge at his belt. "You are brave, rancher, but brave men die the same." Elias raised the rifle barrel just enough to show he would not step aside. "Then I'll die standing." The fall. Warriors on the ridge shouted in their own tongue, the sound rolling like thunder. Tall Crow raised a hand, silencing them. He looked Elias in the eye, voice low and firm. "At sunrise, all will come. Not 3, not 50. All." Elias's chest grew heavy. Chaska's hand found his arm, locket pressed between them. The bond was real, the danger closer than ever. Tall Crow mounted his horse again. He turned without another word, riding back to the line. Behind him, the sea of warriors shifted, torches lifting into the brightening sky. Elias Ward, the rancher, watched in silence. The necklace bit into his wrist. The locket glowed against Chaska's chest. Proof of kinship now bound them all. The envoy's warning echoed across the plain. At sunrise every blade would fall. The first light of dawn rolled across the plains, washing the land in gold. Dust hung low, curling around the barn like smoke. Before a fire, Elias Ward, the rancher, stood at the doorway with his rifle braced against his shoulder. The bead necklace bit into his wrist as he gripped the stock tighter. His jaw locked. He had chosen loyalty, and now the price waited outside. 200 warriors lined the field. Their horses snorted clouds of breath into the morning air. Spears glimmered. Bows creaked as riders shifted in their saddles. The sound was not a roar, but a hum, an army breathing as one. Inside, Chaska crouched near the bench, the silver locket, pressed against his chest. His small body shook, but his eyes were wide and alert. Elias glanced back at the boy once, then returned his gaze to the plain. "Stay down. When they move, we fight." The barn boards groaned under the weight of silence. Elias Ward knew he could not survive 200, but his stance did not break. His finger rested near the trigger, each breath measured. The warriors began to spread, circling the barn like a tightening noose. Torches lifted, the flames sharp against the rising sun. Shadows stretched across the dirt, long and jagged like blades. Elias Ward set his feet, rifle steady. He muttered low, "If I fall standing." Then came the twist. Before Elias could stop him, Chaska pushed to his feet. The boy stepped past the doorway into the open light of dawn. His hand lifted the silver locket high above his head. The chain shook in the wind, but the token caught the sun and blazed. Elias's heart clenched. "Get back!" he barked. But Chaska stood firm, no longer the starving child who had crawled into the dirt. The boy faced the sea of warriors, locket, flashing like fire in his small hand. The riders pulled their reins. Horses stamped and tossed their heads. The creak of boughs faded. The hum of voices stopped. 200 men stared at the boy who dared to stand between them and the barn. The locket swung once in the sunlight, bright as steel. The plain went silent. The plain held its breath. 200 warriors stared at the boy in front of the barn. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood frozen at the doorway, rifle braced. He had prepared to die with steel in his hand. Now Chaska, thin as bone but fierce in spirit, stood before an army holding only a silver locket. The boy raised his voice, speaking in his native tongue. The words came fast, sharp, filled with fire. Though Elias could not understand, he knew the tone, defiance. Chaska's voice carried across the field, cutting through the morning wind. The warriors shifted in their saddles. Some frowned, others nodded. Chaska spoke again, pressing the locket to his chest. The boy pointed at Elias with his other hand. The meaning was clear even without translation. He was calling Elias family. Elias Ward felt something break inside. The rifle lowered. The barrel dipped until it pointed at the dirt. Slowly Elias stepped forward past the doorway until he stood beside Chaska. The boy looked up, eyes blazing. Elias touched the bead necklace on his wrist, then placed a hand on Chaska's shoulder. The tokens, the locket and the necklace, bound them together in plain sight of the enemy. Murmurs rippled through the warriors. Some argued in low voices. Others struck their spears against the ground in protest. The field swelled with debate. "One," warrior shouted, pointing at Elias. The words came sharp, accusing. Another answered, shaking his head, pointing at Chaska instead. Lines divided. Elias Ward, rancher, stood firm, the boy close at his side. His jaw set. He had lived alone too. Long buried too much, he would not bury this boy, Chaska shouted again in his tongue. His thin arm lifted the locket high, the chain catching the sunlight. He spoke of hunger, of mercy, of the bread and water given when death had been close. The boy's voice cracked, but did not break. The crowd stirred, voices louder now. Some warriors lowered their bows, others gripped blades tighter. The plain shook with division. Elias raised his voice then, in English but steady. "I gave my word, I'll stand for him. Kill me if you must, but the boy stays." The words carried less weight in their tongue, but the courage was clear. Elias pressed the beads at his wrist against the locket in Chaska's hand, binding the Two tokens together. Proof of bond, proof of oath. The warriors grew restless. Horses stamped, dust rising in clouds. A decision loomed like a storm. Then Tall Crow rode forward from the line. His black braid swung against his back. His eyes cut through the crowd, silencing them one by one. The noise faded until only the sound of hooves and wind remained. Tall Crow dismounted, his steps heavy in the dirt. He looked at Chaska, then at Elias, then at the tokens held between them. His face showed no anger, only deep weight. Slowly, Tall Crow raised his hand. The warriors hushed, waiting for his judgment. Elias Ward's grip tightened on the boy's shoulder. Chaska held the locket firm against his chest. The plain was silent, the fate of both hanging on a single gesture. The plain stayed quiet. 200 warriors held their weapons but did not strike. All eyes waited on Tall Crow. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood beside Chaska in front of the barn. The bead necklace pressed into Elias's wrist. The silver locket glowed in the boy's hand. Proof of their bond shone in the morning sun. Tall Crow stepped closer, his boots pressed deep into the dirt. He stared hard at Elias, measuring the man. Finally his voice came low but sharp. "Would you bleed for him?" The question cut heavier than a blade. Elias Ward's chest tightened. His life had been marked by silence, by loss, by graves left behind. He had already failed to protect his brother. Now this test was not words, it was judgment. Elias did not hesitate. He lowered his rifle, then lifted his left hand. The palm was rough, scarred from years of work. He stretched it toward Tall Crow. "I would bleed," Elias said, steady. "I already have, and I will again." The field fell silent. Tall Crow looked at the scar, the proof of toil and pain already carried. He drew his knife, the blade catching, light. Warriors stirred, tense as bowstrings. Tall Crow raised the knife high, then turned the blade and pressed the flat side against Elias's hand. No cut, no wound, just the weight of steel. His eyes locked with Elias's. "You are not weak." The crowd shifted. Murmurs rippled through the line. Some lowered their bows, others shook their heads, but none advanced. Tall Crow turned his gaze to Chaska. The boy chose. His voice carried like thunder. "The rancher stands. The oath is seen." Elias Ward stood taller, hand steady even, under the knife's weight. The beads at his wrist and the locket at Chaska's chest bound them in open sight. The proof tokens spoke louder than any word. One warrior dropped his spear, another let his bowstring slack. Slowly, the line of 200 lowered weapons, the threat dissolving into dust. The silence deepened, heavy but no longer filled with death. Horses snorted. Riders glanced at one another. The storm had passed, not by bullet but by courage. Tall Crow stepped back, sliding the knife into his belt. He spoke once more, voice even. "Sun rises, blood does not. Remember this day." He turned and walked to his horse. Elias Ward felt the weight lift, but his hand still shook. The boy pressed close to him, the locket between them. Chaska whispered, soft as breath, yet strong enough to strike the heart. "You are my family now." Elias's throat closed. The words were heavier than any vow, stronger than any bullet. The barn stood behind them. The army stood before them. And yet, for the first time, Elias Ward was not alone. The morning sun rose high, burning away the last of the night's fear. Dust drifted across the plain, glowing in the new light. Elias Ward, the rancher, stood before the barn with Chaska at his side. The boy still held the silver locket, its chain wrapped tight around his small fingers. The bead necklace pressed against Elias's wrist, rough but steady, a weight he had chosen. Both tokens bound them, proof that the choice was no longer just survival, it was loyalty. The line of warriors began to move. One by one, weapons lowered, horses turned. Tall Crow mounted his horse and rode slow across the field. The others followed, dust rising behind them like a river of smoke. The plain emptied until only silence and hoofprints remained. Elias Ward exhaled, shoulders sagging for the first time since the boy had come. He turned to the barn. Its boards were scarred. its windows broken, but it still stood. Inside, the lantern still burned faint against the wall. The barn was not just shelter now. It was witness to a bond made in fire. Chaska looked up, eyes steady, though his voice was soft. "Stay?" Elias nodded. "You stay. This is your home now." The words felt heavier than iron, but truer than anything he had spoken in years. The narrator's voice carried through the scene. Elias Ward, once alone, now stood with proof of kinship at his side. The silver locket, the bead necklace, scars on his hand. All tokens of the oath he had taken. Would you call it weakness or the start of family? The boy leaned against him, holding the locket close. Elias Ward placed a hand on the child's shoulder. For the first time, the rancher's face broke into something rare, a shadow of peace. The wind rattled the barn door once, then settled. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of promise. The barn stood quiet, but Elias Ward's life was never the same.